What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another episode of Best Armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly 40k video series where we go through large events from the past weekend and take a look at undefeated lists. This episode is for August 3rd and 4th, 2024, and we had a pretty packed weekend. While we didn't have too many enormous events, we did have a couple major and super major level events. That included the Salt Lake Open and the Palm Springs Open, alongside a swath of larger GT level events in the 50 to 60 player category. This gives us a wide breadth of results to take a look at, so this is going to be a packed episode. Before we jump into a metagame breakdown, I want to give a thanks to everybody who supports TacticalTortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. The YouTube channel members, you can join in the link down below the video, as well as all the folks who subscribe to me over on Twitch. All you people are amazing, and especially folks over at my Patreon are going to get some early sneak peeks at my next project that I'm working on, which I'm very excited about. But with that, let's get into this metagame breakdown. Necrons had a huge weekend this week, doing excellently at the Iberian Open, Black Tower Brawl, Salt Lake Open, and Gothic Games Canterbury. Thousand Suns also, unsurprisingly, had a big week as well, although they did get nerfed in the update this past Thursday that I have a video about. Most of the events this weekend, I don't think will have used those changes. So the Thousand Suns results for this week are probably not taking those new changes to indirect fire that prevents torrent weapons from using indirect fire at the same time into account. Tyranids also surprisingly having a fairly effective weekend at the Peterborough Slam, as well as Midgard's August GT. Drukhari, unsurprisingly, also doing well with undefeated records at the Palm Springs Open, as well as the War in the Fort GT. Moving on to Space Marines, Space Wolves also did fairly well, going undefeated at the War in the Fort GT, as well as the Armed Forces Day 7. Dark Angels also had an undefeated result with the Gladius Task Force at the Palm Springs Open, and interestingly, Chaos Knights with an undefeated record at the OK Spellen. Now, to be fair, that event did use differential scoring, and there were a total of 4 X, O, and 1 lists at that one. I didn't cover all of them in this video, but that format does tend to create more of those draws. Moving on to Chaos Demons, they also went undefeated at the Armed Forces Day 7, and then we had an insane result from the China Warhammer City GT. This was dominated by Chaos Space Marines and various Chaos Space Marine subfactions, including World Eaters, Chaos Space Marines proper, and Death Guard, all of which went undefeated at that event, and all of which we're going to be talking about today. So with that, let's get in and talk about some lists. At the Salt Lake Open, we saw Necrons go undefeated with Rob Gonzalez at the helm of a Hypercrypt Legion. Now, I only have one result from the Salt Lake Open this weekend, but that's because the event ran a total of 7 rounds over 3 days and actually went all the way to a single undefeated. That was a 100-player event, and Rob Gonzalez was the only undefeated player at the end. So while other events may have more undefeated players, most of that is because the event did not go long enough to result in a single undefeated at the end of the Swiss pairing process. Rob was running a Hypercrypt Legion focusing on Catan shards, including a Catan shard of the Nightbringer, 2 Transcendent Catan, and interestingly, a Catan shard of the Deceiver. The Deceiver is a fascinating pick in this case. He is very good at precisioning out very low wound count characters, and that might make him a little effective into matchups like Adeptus Sororitas, where they are bringing a lot of those maybe 3 or 4 wound characters inside their units. He's also just slightly harder to kill than other Catan shards because he has stealth baked into his profile and also grants you a redeployment, as well as being a higher OC value than, for example, the Nightbringer. While he doesn't do as much damage as other Catan shards, he is better at holding down table space. The list also included 3 Hexmark Destroyers, for utility a single Deathmark unit for that deep strike ability, and 3 Doomsday Arcs to bring up the rear and counterpunch anything that comes out and attacks those Transcendent Catan. It's interesting to see that Necrons are still doing well with these Catan-focused builds, despite the multiple nerfs to Catan shards, as well as the changes to Hypercrypt Legion in the last update to prevent it from being able to use Cosmic Precision on monsters, which was a combination that was used very widely on the Deceiver to take objectives away. It sounds like if we are just taking more guns backing up those Catan shards, we don't need to Cosmic Precision them as much, because your opponent's focus is going to be split between killing the 4 Catan that are sitting in front of their army, or dealing with the 3 Doomsday Arcs hanging out in the back that are poking them to death with giant death rays. Moving over to another big event of the weekend, the Palm Springs Open, a 100 170 player major. This one was won by Nico Urea, who we've talked about previously on this channel for his frankly bizarre Thousand Suns brews. Nico, this time around, was playing a fairly reasonable selection of characters, including an Exalted Disc Sorcerer with the Umbralific Crystal to give him the ability to teleport around, an Infernal Master with Arcane Vortex, Magnus the Red, and 3 Zangor Shamans. The Zangor Shamans are an important inclusion in lists like this. They can offer the list a little bit of utility for very cheap, they can generate Kabbalistic Ritual points, again for a low investment, and they are Kabbalistic Sorcerers themselves, allowing you to throw their movement 10 little body up the table and use them to complete your Kabbalistic Rituals, throw Doom Bolts at your opponent, trigger Warp Sight if you need to, although that will be a little bit less effective now with the changes to Torah weapons, and generally be a useful little guy. We also had 2 units of Rubric Marines to attach those Sorcerer characters into, a unit of Zangor Enlightened, which can house one of the Zangor Shamans. They give it a 5+ Feel No Pain, which makes the Zangor Shamans slightly harder to kill from indirect fire, which can help in some matchups that have a large number of indirect fire weapons, alongside 3 units of Chaos Cultists to act as utility, and a ton of monsters and vehicles, 3 Mutalith Vortex Beasts and 2 Forge Fiends. The Mutalith Vortex Beasts add a ton of mid-board presence to the army. They're difficult to kill and can put out an immense amount of damage, and opponents always have to respect the threat of their enormous railgun attack. They'll also pull focus for the Forge Fiends, which are incredibly efficient at only 135 points, and themselves a difficult defensive profile. Similar to the Catan shards we just talked about, if your opponent is trying to kill the Mutalith Vortex Beasts, oftentimes they won't have the attacks left over to also deal with the Forge Fiends, giving the Forge Fiends multiple turns of pounding into their army with huge blast weapons. And that moves us on to Tyranids, who had an undefeated record at the Peterborough Slam, headed by Greg Chamberlain. Greg was playing an Invasion Fleet, and an extremely monster-heavy version of Invasion Fleet as well. This included Death Leaper as well as a standard Hive Tyrant to add that free stratagem usage and buff up the backbone of shooting that the army was bringing, 2 Hormigaunt units to add a little bit of utility and disruption of enemy objectives, a Biovore for scoring and generating those Spore Mines, alongside a Neurolictor. Interestingly, while Death Leaper was in the list to give -1 leadership near her, there was no Neuro Tyrant in the list to provide that -1 to the Shadow and the Warp check. So the Neurolictor was going to be a lot of the source of Battle Shock checks for this army. But as soon as a unit did get Battle Shocked, having a Neurolictor waiting in the wings to run up and then project its aura onto them was going to be useful. What was benefiting from that aura? We had a ton of monsters. This has included a Norn Emissary, which could benefit from rapid regeneration for a 5+ Feel No Pain even when not on its chosen objective, 2 Maleceptors to form a tough mid-board, alongside 2 Exocrines. We also had 2 Tyrannofexes in the list, one with an Acid Spray to take up the middle of the table alongside those Maleceptors and Norn Emissary, presenting an enormous front line of extremely difficult to kill monsters, alongside one with a Rupture Cannon to support them with some anti-tank firepower. Last and certainly not least, we also had a melee bioweapon warrior unit. This was 6 warriors, and these guys gaining sustain or lethal hits from the detachment ability don't necessarily need a winged Tyranid Prime to get access to those effects, but with any of those critical effects on a unit that attacks as many times as these Tyranid warriors do is incredibly useful. And these guys make incredible use of stratagems like Adrenal Surge to give them additional critical hits and convert more of their attacks. They're an excellent counterpunch to the army, which is mostly going to be taking charges on the enormous bulk of its monsters, protecting them with rapid regeneration, and counterpunching with the ranged attacks from the Exocrines and Tyrannofexes, as well as melee attacks from those warriors. This is an incredibly straightforward army, but looks very effective, and it's cool to see Tyranids doing well. Another faction that we've continued to see do well through the season, we also saw Drukhari undefeated at the War in the Fort GT with a 5-0-1 record, tying with Space Wolves on the finals table. Cody was running what is becoming a more standard build of Drukhari, taking 3 Archons, one with a Nightmare Shroud, one with Phantasmal Smoke. This is a Sky Splinter Assault detachment after all, which I think kind of goes without saying since the Rail Space Raid is not really widely played currently, alongside 3 Beastmasters to provide that early game pressure, a Cabalite Warrior Squad along with the Court of the Archon to attach together, alongside a Raider, Venom, a bunch of support infantry, including a Scourge unit with Dark Lances, 2 Mandrake units for utility, and 15 Incubi in a unit of 10 and a unit of 5. We could embark the big brick of Cabalite warriors in the Court of the Archon alongside an Archon into a Tantalus to allow them to synergize together with all of the Sky Splinter assault abilities. We then have a Raider for the Incubi and a Venom for the smaller Incubi unit that can house the other Archons. Last but certainly not least, we had a Void Raven Bomber in the list alongside 3 Chronos for some additional utility and pain token regeneration. Not too much else to say about this kind of list. We've been seeing lists like this do very well over the last couple of weeks, and we've talked about them quite a bit. Now, speaking of Space Wolves, that moves us on to Space Wolves. I'm actually going to talk about the Armed Forces Day 7 undefeated list, piloted by Elliot Levy, rocking a Stormlance task force. It seems like Space Wolves are back to their old Stormlance ways with a very familiar list. If you're paying attention prior to the Pariah Nexus release, you've probably seen lists like this quite a bit. This included Herald Deathwolf, a Phobos Librarian, alongside an Infiltrator squad to house him in to protect against Deep Strikers. That's exceptionally important right now that Adeptus Sororitas and Drukhari are both doing well. Both of those have access to very effective Deep Strikers, and being able to block them out is important. We also had a combi weapon Lieutenant alongside a ton of Thunderwolf characters. In addition to Herald Deathwolf, we also have Logan Grimnar on a Storm Rider and a Thunderwolf Lord with Fury of the Storm. All of those can attach into the Army's trio of Wolfguard battle leaders on Thunderwolves, one of them equipped with Portents of Wisdom, one of them with Hunter's Instincts. We then saw some support infantry, including a Scout squad, the Infiltrator squad that I mentioned earlier, and an Assault Intercessor jump pack unit, plus a ton of Wolfen, 20 Wolfen in total, including 1 unit of 10 and 2 units of 5. Those are banking up the insane number of Thunderwolf cavalry in the list, a total of 18 to give the list the maximum allotment of mounted models, 3 units of up to 8 Thunderwolf cavalry, once each is attached with a Wolfguard battle leader and a captain character. Now, echoing their classic rivalry with the Space Wolves, we also saw Dark Angels do fairly well this week, especially at the Palm Springs Open 3, where Jeff Jew went undefeated with a Gladius Task Force build. We've been seeing these Gladius Task Force builds quite a bit out of Dark Angels. This one in particular was running Azrael, a Judiciar with Artificer Armor, alongside a Standard Assault Squad, 3 Jump Pack Intercessor squads, a Deathwing Knights unit, alongside an Infiltrator squad, 1 unit of Inner Circle Companions, a max unit of 6 there, a Scout Squad and Calidus Assassin for utility, and 2 Vindicators to take up the midboard and add some shooting presence to the army. At this point, this is a fairly standard build of Dark Angels, using the Gladius Task Force benefits to give the army a good backbone of shooting from those Vindicators, alongside buffing up units like the Deathwing Knights and the Inner Circle Companions with the melee buffs that the detachment also brings. An infantry focus list like this can also make good use of Tactical Doctrine. You can fall back and charge with units like the Deathwing Knight, even after they've absorbed a charge on their enormous bulk, and with the list being infantry focused, being able to reposition units like Terminators and Inner Circle Companions with squad tactics can make it difficult for enemies to engage into. And that moves us on to Chaos Knights. At the OK Spellen, Sebastian Larsson went undefeated with the faction, taking a kind of classic War Dog focused build. This included a War Dog Stalker as the Warlord, 5 War Dog Brigands, a War Dog Huntsman, and 6 War Dog Carnivores. That's it. That's the list. It's cheap and cheerful, and War Dogs are great. I don't have much else to say about this one. It's interesting that we don't see the large knight that we have been seeing more recently in Chaos Knight builds. Instead, we're focusing entirely on these War Dog profiles, but clearly that is working for Sebastian, who did tie for first place with Thousand Suns, as I mentioned previously. Now, that's a good start to the rest of this video, because for the remainder, we are going to be talking quite a bit about Chaos factions. The rest of the entire video is all Chaos all the time, and that includes Chaos Demons, which went undefeated at the Armed Forces Day 7. Kevin Leonard went 5-0 with a Khorne-focused Chaos Demons list, and this list is wild, including an Argath King of Blades equipped Bloodthirster alongside a standard Bloodthirster as well, both of those equipped with Great Axes, and a Rend Master on Bloodthrone to turn on those gorgeous Khorne synergies. The 2 Bloodthirsters together are an important selection. You can use them to sort of Russian nesting doll out of each other's deep strike, since the Bloodthirsters each will treat the area within 6 inches of them as Shadow of Chaos for other Khorne units. That includes 3 units of 6 Blood Crushers, no attachments for those, but that is still a ton of Blood Crushers, alongside 3 units of 5 Fleshhounds and 3 Skull Cannons. There's also a Nurgling unit in there to kind of break the theme, but also be a useful utility unit. This list is absolutely wild and incredibly aggressive. The ability to project threat with 2 Bloodthirsters, either portaling one out of the other one or using both of them to deliver Blood Crusher units with incredibly likely charges. Those Blood Crushers already get +1 to charge from their Instrument of Chaos, so they're already going to be making a 5-inch charge out of Deep Strike, and when you're getting that off a Bloodthirster, it's so easy to do, and that makes lists like these incredibly good at delivering crushing alpha strikes and simply overwhelming the opponent's ability to deal with you. Now we're going to remain with Khorne for a moment and move over to the China Warhammer City GT, which saw 3 separate Chaos Space Marine factions go undefeated, starting with Ronshan Li, who won the event using World Eaters. Ronshan's list was taking Angron, Lord Invocatus, as well as a Juggernaut Lord with Favorite of Khorne. As utility, it also took 2 units of Jackals and a ton of 8-bound, including 2 units of 3, 1 unit of 3 Exalted 8-bound, and a larger unit of 6 Exalted 8-bound to be scouted forward with Lord Invocatus' buff. Following that up was a Lord of Skulls, and that's the entirety of the list. That Khorne Lord of Skulls is incredibly effective. In World Eaters, it gives you good access to a ton of shooting profiles, which gives the list a lot of additional threat, and it pulls a lot of focus from Angron, either counterpunching whatever kills Angron, or taking the hit for Angron and allowing him to get stuck into your opponent's army. Having a backline anchor like this in a World Eater's army that is not predicated on dealing all of its damage in melee and can function independently of Angron is incredibly powerful and gives the list so much offensive power that many armies are not able to out-attrition it before the combination of the 8-bound Angron and the Lord of Skulls remove their offensive assets. Now, we're going to sense a theme here because we also had a Khorne Lord of Skulls in the next list. This is Mafi Chan's Renegade Raiders Chaos Space Marines. For the most part, this is a standard Renegade Raiders build. It's taking 2 Chaos Lords alongside Cypher and Fabius Bile. Cypher is a solid lone operative character, and Fabius Bile is in there as an extremely difficult to kill scenario piece. We also had a Warpsmith to babysit that Lord of Skulls. Following that up was a Cultist mob, 2 units of 5 Legionaries, 2 units of 5 Chosen, and 2 units of 5 Rubric Marines. We've seen all of these inclusions before in these Renegade Raiders selections, alongside a Chaos Biker unit, a Predator Destructor to add some long-range counterpunch, and 3 Chaos Rhinos to ferry those Legionaries, Rubric Marines, and Chosen up the battlefield and get them stuck into the opponent. Last but certainly not least is that Lord of Skulls, and this guy synergizes particularly well with the Renegade Raiders detachment abilities. Getting Assault on his ranged weapons gives the Lord of Skulls a lot more mobility when it comes to bringing its guns on target. While they have a fairly middling movement characteristic to begin with, Lords of Skulls can benefit a lot from threat range increasers because it allows you to tag more terrain features and use that towering keyword to fire over them to hit targets that thought they were protected by intervening ruins. On top of that, you also have an Armor of Contempt available in the list, which can make the Lord of Skulls much more difficult to kill, and that +1 AP when targeting enemies on objectives makes the ranged weapon profiles of the Lord of Skulls that much more effective. On top of that, the Renegade Raiders tend to also focus on these lighter infantry units. Things like Legionaries, Rubric Marines, and Chosen are not the most difficult units in the game to kill once they're committed to the fight, and having a Lord of Skulls seating in the back there in order to anchor for your list is, just as we talked about with World Eaters, incredibly strong. This is a super cool and unique build of Renegade Raiders, and I'm excited to see innovation within the Chaos Space Marine community, which has been flagging a little bit of late. Now, last but certainly not least, for this week and the final undefeated player at the China Warhammer City GT was Jerry Zhang playing Death Guard. This list is a little bit of a throwback to 6 months or so ago before we saw many changes to Death Guard builds. It includes 2 Biologus Putrefiers as well as a Foul Blightspawn with the droning. This is a points filler enhancement that deals mortal wounds when enemies suffer battle shock checks near him. Following that up is Typhus, acting independently in this list alongside a Malignant Plaguecaster. Those were attached into 4 units of Plague Marines, 2 units of 10, as well as 2 units of 5, all of these being ferried to the battle in Death Guard Rhinos. This is a classic combination that we've seen for a really long time. Plague Marines have good both ranged and melee profiles and are just generally efficient units to commit into the fight in the center of the table. They get pushed even farther with Biologus Putrefiers on those larger units, which can make them extremely effective, especially in melee. That's followed up by a little bit of utility in the form of a Death Guard Cultist unit, as well as 2 Fetid Blow Drones, and then we also had a bunch of backline shooting, including a Predator Destructor and 3 Plague Burst Crawlers, all of those equipped with Entropy Cannons. It's been a little while since we've seen mass fast Plague Burst Crawlers on the table, and while they do present an extremely effective indirect fire battery, the nerfs to indirect fire have made them a little bit less palatable. That said, in old school lists, we often saw Mortarion brought in to ignore the penalties to indirect fire. That's no longer necessary. Instead, these Plague Burst Crawlers are just going to be kind of acting on their own. They can still fire indirectly, hitting on 4s anyway, not suffering quite as much from that penalty since they would already be hitting on 4s as well. That also gives you either a good unit that you can force your opponent to overcommit into to then counterpunch with the Plague Marines and the Rhinos, or vice versa, a unit that can hold down the board after the Plague Marines have done their dirty work. It's really cool to see lists like this back at the top of the game because it's been a little while since we've seen these classic styles of Death Guard builds do very well. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.